Hey everyone, it's Laura again from Yosemite Conservancy, and this is the final video of our virtual watercolor series. Feel free to treat this as a virtual paint and sip. I've got my coffee here, but feel free to grab a beverage of your choice and some art supplies so we can get started. So a few of the materials that you'll need for today's virtual paint and sip are a watercolor set, a few watercolor brushes. I recommend at least one flat brush and one round brush, some watercolor paper, a paper towel, a cup of water and a spray bottle, some masking tape, and a hardboard that you can tape your paper onto. And for a hardboard, you can also use a piece of cardboard from your recycling. And then a few optional materials. I like to use a hairdryer sometimes to speed up the drying process of my paint. And then last but not least, a beverage of your choice. So today I'm drinking some coffee, but you can choose some bubbly water or tea or even a glass of wine if you'd like. Just a little pro tip though, if you're drinking a beverage while you're painting today, I would recommend keeping your water cup on one side. I usually keep it on the side of my dominant hand, so I'm right-handed. And then keeping your beverage on the opposite side so that you don't run the risk of dipping your paintbrush into your beverage, because it's never good to drink paint. So it's a good idea to tape down your paper to a hard surface like a drawing board. But if you don't have a drawing board, you can also use cardboard. So I just pulled this out of my recycling today. And I'm going to use a book that I pre-measured. So this is a 5x7 size book. So that ensures that this painting later, when I'm finished with it, can actually fit into matting or a frame in case you'd like to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and trace. And now what I'll do is go ahead and tape down my paper. So having your paper taped down will prevent your paper from buckling, but it also allows you to tilt your paper a little bit during the painting process. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a quick sketch of Yosemite Falls, and I'm just gonna sketch in the waterfall. All right, so I have a very preliminary sketch. You'll notice I didn't sketch in any trees or anything like that. And the reason why is that we're gonna layer those over the top, and I'll guide you through that. So it might sound daunting right now, but just shake off those nerves and rest assured that I'll guide the way. So to start off our painting, we're gonna mix together ultramarine blue and burnt umber to create a gray color. So one little tip that I'll give is that it's helpful to mix a generous amount of this gray color because we're covering a lot of space. And I'm gonna go ahead and do a little test swatch just to make sure I have the right color gray that I'm looking for. And that looks pretty good. Just keep in mind that we're gonna use a wet on wet technique for the granite walls. So it is gonna come out a little bit lighter than that because we're mixing it with more water. And so the way that I like to approach painting the granite walls is I like to split it up by the 4 sections and work one section at a time. So I'm going to use my flat brush, and remember with wet on wet, we're just painting our paper with water first. So now we can go ahead and add in some of that paint. And so if you look at a picture of Yosemite Falls, you'll notice that either side of the waterfall is a little bit darker, and that's because the granite is wet from the water misting onto the granite. So to kind of capture that effect, I like to take a little bit of the gray that we mixed here and just add in some little dots along the edges. And I'm tilting my paper so that they kind of spread out the same way the mist from the waterfall would. And keep in mind, I'm doing this while that paint is still wet. So it's important to make sure your paper is still wet when you do that, because you're gonna come out with a little bit of a different effect if you try to do this when your paint and your paper is dry. And you'll notice that some of the paint is beading at the edges here. If you wanted to remove that, you want a dry brush, and you can pick up that paint by just running your brush along the edge there. Perfect. And then that ensures that your paint isn't just splashing off of your paper and onto your table. And so I usually like to move to the other side of the waterfall and repeat this step on the other side. And I don't normally do the wet edges on the lower fall, but if you'd like to do that, you can. So we'll go ahead and fill in the rest of the granite walls. All right, so now we're gonna go ahead and let this part dry. So now we're gonna touch on some skills we learned in a previous video about value and paint some trees similar to that one. I'm gonna use sap green, and it's helpful to bring it into a little mixing area. And if you'll remember, sap green is the warmer green of the two. There's viridian green and sap green. And viridian is more of a cool color. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna paint a row of trees on either side of the lower falls area, because we're gonna start to kind of frame the falls section. And remember, if you have a different technique to paint trees, that's totally fine. Feel free to use whatever is most comfortable for you. So now that we're finished with that first row of trees, we're gonna go ahead and let them dry, and we're gonna work on a different part of the painting to give them some time. So So I like to move on to the sky because it's kind of at the top, so we don't run any risk of mixing the paints together. And so for the sky, I'm gonna use a wet on wet technique. And you can add one color to the sky, or you can use a gradient to paint your sky. Don't forget that you can also use that lifting technique with a paper towel to create some fluffy clouds while your paint is still wet. So I'm going to mix a color combination, and I'm just gonna do one single color across the sky. But I like to mix a little bit of phthalo blue, so that's kind of our warm blue, with ultramarine blue. And then just a tinge of viridian green, and that's like our cool green color. I like to create a nice cool sky. So I'm gonna do a color swatch. That's really, really dark. And keep in mind, whenever you're doing a wet on wet technique, your color is gonna come out a little bit lighter. So this is a little bit closer to the color we'll see. I think I like it. I'm gonna go for it. So let's get some water onto our paper using our brush. So now we're gonna go ahead and let the sky dry, and it seems like our trees are still not finished drying up. So something that we can work on is adding a little bit of texture and movement to the waterfall area, because you'll notice it kind of just looks blank right now. So a trick that I have for that is what I like to do. So I like to make sure that my brush is completely wiped off of any paint. And you'll notice it has a lot of pigment on it right now. Looks like we're getting close to clear. So what I'm gonna do is dip my brush in that gray color again, and I'm adding more water to it. So I'm gonna really lighten it up right now. So we'll do a test swatch. Yep, it's a lot lighter. And so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna have my paper towel ready because we're gonna use a little bit of that lifting technique that we learned a while back. And I'm just gonna add like some squiggly lines to give the waterfall some movement. And now what I'm gonna do is just blot it really quickly. And that way the lines are nice and subtle. And you can even add more if you want. And you can also do that for the bottom fall. And so it's really subtle, but you'll be able to see it in person when you try it out. So we'll go ahead and make sure that the rest of the painting dries before we move on to the next step. So now that our first row of trees is dry, we're gonna go ahead and add another row in front of it. And these trees are gonna be just a tinge darker. So what I'm gonna do is mix sap green, our warm green, with burnt sienna. And burnt sienna is kind of like a warm reddish brown color. So we'll go ahead and let that dry. All right, so now we're gonna add some trees in the foreground. So they're gonna be a little bit bigger. So I'm gonna use the color Burnt Umber, and it's kind of like a really nice dark brown color. I'm gonna go ahead and gather it in one of the mixing trays. All right, so we're kind of painting over our painting right now, which is a little bit scary, but just trust the process. And just a few little tidbits. If you have an area that you're not super happy about, like say you messed up somewhere in a corner, this is a great time to put a tree over that, and then no one will ever know that you messed up. So this first layer, I'm gonna add a tree right about here. This first layer, you'll notice that the brown is a little bit translucent, and that's okay because we're gonna kind of build it up in layers. Also make sure that the bases of your trees are nice and wide, and then they get skinny going up because that gives the effect that you're looking up at the trees. So now we're gonna go ahead and let this section dry. And again, you'll notice that some of these areas are still a little bit translucent, and that's okay. So using Burnt Umber again, we're gonna add some texture to the trees by painting some lines using an up and down brush stroke. So adding another layer of the same color will make it appear darker. And you can also create shadows on the tree by applying more paint to one side of the tree. All right, so we'll go ahead and let that dry. So if you want to add a little bit more depth and texture, you can repeat the last step and add more lines to your tree trunks using either a darker brown or a gray color. So if you wanted to use this brown and build it up into a darker color, you could add some ultramarine blue, or you can use gray. I'm gonna try this darker brown and see how that looks. And now mixing a little bit more of a gray. It almost looks black. Let's try it out. Ooh, that does look like black. All right, so we'll go ahead and let that dry. So now we're gonna work on adding the foliage to the trees. So I'm gonna mix Viridian Green, which is a cool green color, with Burnt Umber, which is our really dark, warm brown color. And it'll make a nice forest green. So to add the green foliage to the tree, you can use that stippling motion again that we used in our trees earlier. But this time you can be a little bit more heavy-handed with it since these trees are in the foreground. They're a little bit bigger. And then to add a little bit more depth and show some dimension to the tree, you can also darken this green by adding ultramarine blue. You can kind of just sporadically add that around, even while the paint is wet. So we'll go ahead and repeat this for the rest of the trees. overnight, so we'll go ahead and let this dry. Once your painting is completely dry, you can start to pull the tape off. And now you can take a pen and sign your work of art. You can either sign somewhere within the painting or you can sign just below. Thank you all so much for tuning in with us for a virtual paint and sip. As always, we'd love to see what you make, so don't forget to snap a picture and share it with us at Yosemite Conservancy using #HappyIslesArt. If you liked this tutorial and you're interested in future Yosemite art classes, including wine and paint, you can always visit our website for more information, and we'll make sure to keep this page updated as we await the park's reopening.